Today's gospel reading is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The church transformed Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but at the same time, that change that happened within him would end up crushing him. Bonhoeffer was a brilliant theological mind. He had a PhD by the time he was 21 years old. He certainly would have been one of the great Christian thinkers of the 20th century, but he found himself instead sitting at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. This church taught him a new way to read the Bible and the world. It transformed his faith and his actions, but that transformation would ultimately lead to his death. Bonhoeffer is sort of a legendary figure in modern Christianity. He was a pastor and theologian during the rise of Nazism in Germany, and he consistently wrestled with the proper Christian response to that evil. He went to study at one point in New York City, but it wasn't his seminary education there that transformed him. It was this church, whose music, whose community, and whose gospel changed his faith and his life forever. You see, the pastor of Abyssinian preached a social gospel and addressed issues like segregation from a Christian perspective. Scholars agree that this black church in New York is where Bonhoeffer learned to read the Bible from below. That is, he learned to notice what was true all along, that the Bible was written by an oppressed people, a people whose throat was under the boot of some empire for most of their existence. And I think he truly came to understand our gospel reading for this morning from Luke 4. So Bonhoeffer returned to Germany to see the world from below, considering who exactly hears good news in the gospel. He became a dissenting voice against an oppressive government, even participating in an attempt to kill Hitler. And he paid for all of this with his life. One thing is absolutely certain. Christianity today would not be the same had Bonhoeffer accepted a tenure-track position in Germany and never ventured out into that black Baptist church in Harlem. Our gospel reading this morning recounts Jesus' first public act in Luke, a celebrated moment, a moment when Jesus announces his ministry and summarizes his purpose. Jesus sort of tips his hand for us and shows us that he is tapping into an ancient tradition. He is tapping into the prophetic tradition of Judaism. God bringing hope and liberation where there was only darkness and enslavement. You see, for the prophets, God is always the God of the Exodus, hearing the cries of people who are in desperate need of salvation. So Jesus proclaims that God is still transforming our reality, upturning the world as it is. The poor hear good news for once. The incarcerated are acquitted, and the blind literally see the grace of God. This is the year of Jubilee, Jesus says. The year of the Lord's favor is a reference to this Jubilee. The instruction given in Leviticus that every 50 years, the people of Israel were to make God's mercy a concrete reality in their community. So, every 50 years, debts would be forgiven. People who had been enslaved or imprisoned for some reason would be freed. And any lands that had been sold outside the family would be returned to their original owners. So when Jesus was led by the Spirit out into the wilderness, Satan tempted him to use his power for himself, to feed his stomach and his renown. But Jesus announces right after that temptation that his ministry was going to be one of Jubilee power, rather than making those on the top a little bit higher. Jesus' ministry would take the ones on the bottom and raise them up. What a beautiful proclamation here in Luke 4. Jesus apparently knew how to read scriptures from below as well. Now, did you know that occasionally people actually disagree with each other based on the way they read scriptures? Now, I know we're in a Baptist church, so you would never expect anything so scandalous or preposterous to happen among us, but in biblical times at least, there were at times quarrels and qualms among religious communities. I'll give you a tiny spoiler from next week that people weren't quite ready to hear this message that Jesus had for them. They were excited in our reading this morning. They praised Jesus' message until he indicated that this good news was really for everybody. Then they knew Jesus had taken this gospel business a little bit too far. You see, Jesus was invited to participate in synagogue. He'd come home to his hometown after the Spirit led him back from the wilderness, and he found himself standing in the synagogue and reading from the scroll of Isaiah. After he read it in Hebrew, he would have been expected to give some commentary on it in Aramaic for the people to better understand. So Jesus gives this powerful summary of his ministry that will take place over the next year. And then his only interpretation of it is that this prophetic text had been fulfilled as they heard it. A bold claim. But maybe as important as what Jesus says here is what Jesus left unsaid. He ends the reading with this year of the Lord's favor, tapping into the prophetic tradition and the Jubilee tradition. But Isaiah 61 ends a little bit differently. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. Jubilee? Yes, says Jesus. But the day of vengeance is missing. Jesus hints, I think, at the fact that this message is not one about safety and security for your own people, while God is going to bring vengeance on the enemies of Israel. God instead, in this prophetic tradition, is reversing things, upsetting the power and privilege that many had come to enjoy. People didn't read this scripture quite the same way that Jesus did, so they invited him to leave his hometown. This community had shaped him and probably had taught him to read Isaiah in the first place. But we know that his message will ultimately lead to his death as well. Luke never tells us this, but I think it's safe to guess that had Jesus stayed in Nazareth and maybe accepted a tenure-track position exploring the Hebrew Bible, our world would be a very different place had he never ventured up to Jerusalem. So that may remind you a little bit of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Maybe both he and Jesus were shaped by encountering people outside of their normal borders. This story also reminds me of Martin Luther King Jr., probably because we just celebrated him last weekend. But Dr. King knew what it was like to step into another person's experience. You see, Martin Luther King Jr. was really middle class. He had a PhD. He was a drum major for justice, as we remember him fondly, on behalf of those who were socially and economically at the bottom. But I really don't think that's something that he had to do. I imagine he could have gotten by because he undoubtedly experienced racism and discrimination, but he also, at the same time, was not in dire poverty. But we know his end as well, that he gave himself tirelessly for the cause of God's justice in our nation. And our own country would be a vastly different place if he had also taken his PhD, accepted a tenure-track position, and not ever ventured out into the streets as a public pastor and activist. Now, because we like to think theological thoughts in this room, we know that Jesus knew a little bit something about this experience beyond just leaving his hometown of Nazareth. Our theology claims that Jesus is the incarnation of the living God. Jesus is God become human. Presumably, God has the power to accomplish things any way that God sees fit, but the way our God brings light and life and salvation to this world is through a great reversal. God becomes human so that humans might taste the divine. Jesus comes to earth and experiences pain and suffering so that that pain and suffering might be healed forever. So Jesus preaches in Nazareth about this great reversal in the terms of Jubilee. And it's easy for us to stay in the theological and the spiritual. If you were to peruse biblical commentaries over the last centuries, really, you would find a long tradition that reads the gospel as being good news to the poor in spirit, sight given to the spiritually blind who were unable to see the sin that kept them captive, and release to those who were captives to sin. Now, I think these things are true, friends. There's great freedom that experiencing God in Jesus Christ brings all of us. There's a freedom from being shackled to the powers of sin, the powers that cause suffering and evil and hell on earth for so many people. There's good reason that our theology usually begins with this spiritual salvation from sin. However, we also have to recover something that has often been overlooked. Jesus was making a statement about justice in our everyday reality. Jesus was sent to proclaim good news to the poor, the actual impoverished, vulnerable, and physically hungry. Jesus' ministry was one of letting the oppressed go free. This constituted a new reality, one that envisioned that power of Jubilee instead of the power of the Roman Empire. And Jesus' vision of Jubilee is one for everybody that doesn't include vengeance against people that don't look like us. We need to pause for just a moment here because many of us are aware of our faith's history of hearing this message as an indication that Jews were looking for God's vengeance and a Messiah to overthrow their enemies, but Jesus preached grace. Of course, there were some Jews who hoped this, but Jewish messianic hopes were no more unified than our political hopes are today. Jesus wasn't proclaiming an anti-Jewish gospel here. He was a Jew, if you've forgotten. Instead, Jesus taught a message that every religious community needs to hear. Don't get caught up in the powers of this world, supporting empires and economies that crush people under their feet. Instead, Christians should be in the business of moralizing and redeeming power so that the poor hear good news and you can fill in the rest. All who feel the crushing weight of oppression are liberated. This is the goal that every religion should be working toward, but we too often forget our divine calling. This isn't a rejection of Judaism for Christianity. It's a reminder of our shared calling to embody Jubilee. For many of us, though, I think we hear this Jubilee message, and this sounds like something that will indeed transform us, but also may just crush us. If Jesus has good news for the poor, what sort of news does he have for the not so poor? If the gospel is good news for the poor, is it bad news for people with wealth? Jubilee sounds like a wonderful thing for people who owe debts and whose ancestral lands have been lost over the last 49 years. But what about people who are still owed money in that 49th year? What about people who had legitimately purchased that land? Seems to me that Jubilee sort of gives them the short end of the stick. We see this question, though, all the time. If black lives matter, do white lives not matter? If there's a toxic masculinity, does that mean that maleness is toxic? If we believe women, do we disbelieve men? If white supremacy should be dismantled, is this some sort of reverse racism? These are questions and topics that swirl the air in our culture. When those on the bottom get some good news, it often feels like bad news for people who have grown accustomed and comfortable to being on top. But friends, don't miss that this is the beauty of the gospel. Jesus speaks these words of Jubilee and stops short of vengeance. In Jesus' reality, there is liberation and transformation, not only a reversal of things. What seems like bad news for people on top ends up being good news because we are all freed from these oppressive powers. We're aware, you and I, that white supremacy dehumanizes black people and white people. We know that toxic masculinity, like any poison, ends up poisoning us all. This makes me think of a stoplight. There was a stoplight on my way home over the past few years that at about 9:30 when I was on my way home from class, I always hit this light red. Always. And every time, one of two men would be standing at that light with a sign asking for help. And my first instinct was usually, I never have cash. I never think ahead to this moment. I'll just not make eye contact. The light's almost green. And clearly, I don't think that my few dollars given or withheld would change the system and the situation that keep this man on the corner. However, I have to wonder if that little decision to keep my head down and avert my eyes may just crush both of our souls. You see, we all have the opportunity to remain safely in our tenured positions of security and privilege. Or we can venture out and we can encounter people who may transform us in risky ways, but end up saving us both. So Jesus' summary of his ministry is a helpful summary for us today, I think. Good news for the poor and oppressed is our proclamation. And we know that this ends up being good news for everyone. If we're going to imitate Jesus and embody Jubilee in our reality, we have to look some people in the eyes if we're going to see the good news. Bonhoeffer and King knew how to look at those at society's bottom and hear Jesus' message of reversal. Their work may have gotten them killed, but I think their ministry just may have saved them as well. We have to venture out to find our own salvation, even if it seems like it may crush us. Then, just then, we might proclaim a year of the Lord's favor. Amen.